Today we enter the season of Advent, the days of the Christian calendar leading up to Christmas, which aligns with the rituals found in many of the religious traditions and practices of the world. This is the time of year when darkness takes over more of each 24-hour period in the Northern Hemisphere, and so we brace ourselves for the darkness, and we create rituals of lighting candles and casting out the bleak winter night. We light candles as symbols of hope, joy, peace, and love as we approach a time of mystery and waiting for dayspring to break again. In this framing of the annual cycle, darkness dons the cloak of despair, sadness, violence, and the discord we wish to banish. In color theory, the value of a color refers to its lightness or darkness. Adding white to a color produces a high value, and adding black produces a low value. Embedded in our language, our concepts, in our stories, in our traditions, and deep in our psyches is the valuing of light and the devaluing of dark. We expel the darkness and grasp for the light. In countless ways, we equate lightness and whiteness with goodness and virtue. In the same way, we think of darkness and blackness as evil to be avoided and feared. Imagine our ancestors long ago, before knowing what we know now, that the earth spins on its axis and orbits the sun, creating cycles of light and dark, warmth and cold, times when we see the sun and when it disappears from view. Imagine how terrifying the dark might have been when fires were doused by wind or rain. Imagine the fear of devastated harvests when the sun was scarce. And let's be real, in our current reality, it's still hard to wake up at 6:30 in the morning when it's dark outside and have our workday end at it's 4:30 when it's dark again. It's depressing for a lot of folks. In the days when light is scarce, it can be easy to forget that we need the dark too. We need the nutrients of the dark soil to grow just as much as we need the light. Yet the light is so idealized and sought after, and the dark is so reviled. Perhaps it's the vulnerability we feel when our full use of sight is missing that leads us to recoil from the dark and to glorify the light. The first words of the Hebrew Bible speak of darkness as something to overcome and light as the first great creation. Genesis chapter 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the universe and the earth. It was a desert and a wasteland. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw how beautiful the light was. God separated between the light and the darkness. God named the light day, and the darkness he named night, and there was evening and morning the first day." Here in this early religious text, the dark is described as a wasteland and light as beautiful and good. But we forget that first there was darkness. In fact, we might interpret from this reading that darkness is the primary source, the creative depths from which all things emerge. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. But this isn't how we interpret this text typically, nor is it the way that we understand countless examples and stories illustrating the fearsome dark. The notion of darkness being bad, evil, or something to be feared, and light being virtuous, good, and something to always strive for is so tightly woven throughout our language. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as he inspired racial harmony, used the words and imagery of darkness in negative ways, midnight of our suffering and despair, a time to overcome and endure until the light of dawn. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that, he said. And then there's every Disney movie ever made with its villains always cast in black, from The Lion King's Scar and The Little Mermaid's Ursula, the sea witch. It's a trope that Disney certainly didn't invent, but they figured out how to make quite a profit from it. Of course, all of this is metaphor, right? And yet metaphor is powerful. If it wasn't, we wouldn't need to say Black Lives Matter. When we value light and devalue dark, even allegorically, there are real-world impacts on the lives of people with black bodies. Scientific studies show that people with darker skin are more likely to be seen as criminals and feared, and that is why we must affirm the value of black lives to counter that hidden and destructive narrative. If words didn't matter, we wouldn't be arguing about whether we should name the evil of white supremacy as it exists in our systems. The power infused in our words can cause great harm and incite violence, or they can coalesce into just laws, inspiring words, and transformative policies. If words didn't matter, it wouldn't be so hard to change them and use them to reshape our reality and our relationships. What are we to do with this deeply embedded notion of the goodness of light and the terror of darkness? Is it possible to embrace the value of both what darkness and light have to offer? Can we overcome our fear of the dark? What if we thought of darkness as a deep and powerful source of creative power, of renewal and restoration? What if we moved into this time of growing darkness, setting aside our fear and desire to cast it out? What if we approach this time of darkness with anticipation, embracing it, and letting it embrace us? We may be afraid of our own internal depths, afraid that we won't be able to get out if we truly let ourselves sink into the darkness. Depression is a frightening reality for many of us, and I don't wish to minimize it. But I believe there can be a way through depression and the dark times, not by avoidance or shining a bright light in every corner, but by being still in it, embracing it for just a bit. Quaker theologian and teacher Parker Palmer, who has wrestled with his own depression, talks about his experience as a full body experience and a full body immersion in the darkness, an invitation to take our embodied selves a lot more seriously than we tend to. Palmer is speaking of the resilience and meaning that can be absorbed and carried forward in our bodies when we are able to endure and even embrace the darkness of life. It reminds me of a story that I recently read by Reverend Kimberly Debus, her retelling. One day, Sam is walking along and falls into a deep, dark hole. He tries and tries, but can't get out. He shouts and shouts, but no one hears. Finally, a doctor walks by, sees Sam, peers into the hole. "Hey, doc, I've fallen down this hole. Can you help me out?" The doctor writes a prescription and throws it down the hole and walks on by. A little while later, a minister walks by, sees Sam, and peers into the hole. Hey, Reverend, I've fallen down this hole. Can you help me out?" The minister says a prayer, tosses some prayer beads down the hole, and then walks on. Sam is about to give up when an old friend comes by. "Hey, Joe, I've fallen down this hole. Can you help me out?" Joe jumps into the hole. "Joe, what are you, nuts? Now we're both stuck down here." "I know," says Joe. but I've been here before and I know my way out. There are creative ways out of the darkness if we remember that we're not alone there. We can reach out a hand, we can lean a shoulder, or press our backs together and push our legs up against the wall and shimmy our way out in partnership. Though the dark can feel lonely and frightening, sometimes in the dark we can let our eyes adjust and see things in a new way. In the dark, our other senses can be heightened, and we can find varied ways of determining what is real. The quiet darkness can be generative, leading to an emergence of new possibilities. Embracing the dark, we can better sense what's missing, what has escaped our awareness. The glaring light shined on dominant narratives can mask the intentionally buried stories. In the quiet stillness and darkness, we can look for those stories that are hidden by colonization and oppression. Some of you may have been long aware, but I'm just catching on to the growing practice of land acknowledgement. This is the naming and honoring of indigenous peoples who have inhabited the lands where we now live and gather to recognize what was present before they were forced to leave and cede the land to European settlers and colonizers. It's an effort to bear witness to the broken land treaties that make up the history of the United States. I encourage you to explore this land acknowledgement through, there's a website called Native-Land, or you can download Honor Native Land. It's a guide to land acknowledgement from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. I put a link to it on our social justice group page on Facebook. Indigenous history has been intentionally obscured, often untold or tokenized, but Indigenous people of the Americas are living and resisting the forces that would erase them. Cedric Cromwell, Tribal Council Chairman of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe of Massachusetts, said at a Thanksgiving Unity reception in 2017, quote, "We exist. We are not forgotten. We want to be heard and respected. We have a voice," unquote. It is important to search for what is hidden and name what is missing rather than letting the dominant narrative exist in the spotlight unquestioned while the deeper truths of Native American genocide are concealed. This Thanksgiving, I shared a blessing at our interfaith service on Wednesday at St. Nick's, and I also shared this blessing before the meal that I shared with my family. I gave thanks for the food we shared and the land from which it came, and I acknowledged that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux. I know that several others who were planning to do a similar acknowledgement at their family gatherings. Acknowledgement is a critical public intervention, a necessary step toward honoring Native communities and enacting a much larger project of decolonization and reconciliation, says the Honor Native Lands Guide. Seeking out untold stories of Native communities and listening to Indigenous voices tell the real history is important. The UU Common read this year is An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and there's a young people's version as well. The nonfiction book group is discussing this book in March, and I hope that we can continue to learn from it and other sources. Indigenous peoples have survived by passing down their stories to each generation. Stories of the cycles of the seasons and of the days turning into nights and night into day. The wisdom of our stories is in their fullness, their complexity, encapsulating darkness and light, positive and negative. And the same is true for the stories of this congregation. We've been talking a lot about stories, and a lot about the shared stories that we have in this church. Last week, Reverend Karen and the transitions team lifted up the legacies of our former ordained ministers. They mentioned some of the positive things that they have left us and invited us each to write down some of our memories. We have those pages out again this week for you to continue to add your stories of legacy. Some questioned why we didn't name Mary Sheldon our Director of Religious Education last year, but for the sake of time, we only named ordained ministers in the service last week. Of course, lots of people have left their legacies with us, including Mary, and she is listed on the paper along with some of our interns, so please do share their stories and their legacies too. As we strive to find a balance between the positive and the negative, the hurts we bury and the joys we forget to celebrate, we need to be mindful of how we share them. Idealizing or romanticizing the past isn't helpful, and neither is hiding the past or weaponizing our wounds. We need to look with love and kindness together at the truth of our community. It is by jumping into the dark together and finding our way out through cooperation and covenant that we can more fully live our shared mission. How might we embrace the dark in this time of anticipation, this season of Advent leading toward the darkest night and the slow journey back to the sun? What can the darkness teach us if we settle into it? And how can the balance of light and dark reveal to us a fuller truth? We need the balance of both dark and light, shadow and sun, day and night. There is a time for everything and a value of all things. We can recognize the beauty and the value of darkness for the rest and renewal it can bring. As I've taken on the responsibilities of being your senior minister, I've noticed that time is even more precious. It takes all my intention to create space and dedicate time to my spiritual practice. The one time of week I truly feel absorbed in the moment and not worrying about what's next is when I'm in my art studio class on Monday afternoons. I'm currently painting a picture of my dog, Sully. And I marvel at the seemingly infinite number of shades of browns and yellows and grays in his fur. Adding a tiny bit of white or a tiny bit of black to any shade enables me to create a wide range of hues and paint the canvas with contrasts that bring the image to life. I'm aware as I paint that my mind and my spirit need contrast too. I need the respite from the bright expectations of the day. I need the rest of the nighttime. I need the space in each day to cultivate peace and grounding in my soul. We need the blending of contrasting dark and light hues in our lives. We need the restoration of the dark and the illumination of the night. May we find ways together to value the darkness, the quiet stillness, the time to reflect, the different ways of sensing what is true and real. May we embrace the darkness and let it embrace us, and may we find balance and create equity. As we enter this time of anticipation and growing darkness, may we be present to the moment, and may we cultivate peace. May we make it so. Amen.